This conference will now be recorded.
So we definitely are in record mode now. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit today is the speed limit setting process that many of us have experienced in our careers and deal with probably on a daily basis when we go out and we use the highway system. And there's been a lot of changes just in the last year or so. And I wanted to speed through sort of what instigated some of them and where we are today. And we can engage in discussion and questions you may have quickly thereafter. So, Pam, are you doing the slides or do I have control?
I have control, so if you want me
Okay,
to, just let me know when you want me to go to the next slide.
I'll give you a quick thumbs up.
Okay.
Okay. So what initiated the process in setting changing and setting speed limits is a couple of things probably help motivate activities. One is the National Transportation Safety Board report that came out a few years ago, made some recommendations to US DOT and FHWA regarding the 85th percentile. In addition, other groups like NACDO were concerned about the over-reliance of the use of the 85th percentile. And with that, I was fortunate enough to be involved with the National Committee, and we got involved in a bunch of research work, doing some surveys on how speed limits were set. And we dug in a little bit deeper as we got into it to just sort of figure out where speed was playing a role. And where most of the statutory speed limits that we have in place affect freeways, they're usually set at very high speeds. There's very little in the area where we have the most amount of fatalities, which is on arterials. And so a lot of the context that people had been using, and some of that context dates back to the 40s in the MUTCD and has been recently changed since the 2000s, is really built off of highway or freeway type infrastructure and not so necessarily context sensitive at that arterial level. And so we, as part of the National Committee, went in and made some recommendations and January of 2018. And I wanted to focus in two areas. And Pam, I don't know if you can, on your computer, jump to the hyperlink there, but on lines 304 and 316 of the MUTCD recommendation to FHWA that was made just a year or so ago, you can go onto the website, and that's what this document is from. You just type in NCUTCD, go to the approved changes, look for speed limits, and this document will pull up. If you slide down to line 304 real quickly, Pam, the first thing was there had been in the MUTCD a lot of factors that have been talked about for many years that date back into the 50s about setting speed limits and different criteria that are utilized. And those over the years had been originally up in paragraph number 1, and they migrated over time to paragraph 16. And one of the things that we felt was important was to deal with those factors and the recommendation that the National Transportation Safety Board had come up with to specifically change from conditions that were a may condition to conditions that are should. And you can see those recommendations here in text. If you slide up a little bit more, Pam, the thing that I think is important to articulate with the changes are just a couple of things. First, the change from may to should, moving it forward into paragraph 1, and then identifying 5 groupings that are a little bit different than what were in the MUTCD today in 2009, talking about speed distribution, crashes, road characteristics, road context, and road users, and added parameters to deal with things like bike lanes, bike users, and medians. And those contexts now are part of the speed limit process. It sets a framework, it doesn't tell you the how. And a lot of the how is set by policies that states have. And then if you slide down, and you can see it here on the screen on line 316, it was in the middle of the screen. Line 316 basically talks about the 85th percentile. And in the documents, NACDO and National Highway Safety Board both had talked about the removal of the 85th percentile. But being, sort of an engineer and into science and, ignoring facts doesn't seem like a really good way to advance studies of evaluations of speed. And I think one of the things that we found when we went through was the over-reliance on the 85th percentile for all contexts, for all roadways in all settings in some jurisdictions had probably taken hold a little more than others. And so what we wanted to do was clarify where the 85th percentile is most appropriate, which is on freeways, expressways, and rural highways. And so instead of a general overarching statement that the 85th percentile is used everywhere, that doesn't mean you can't use it, and you can't study it or can't evaluate it, but it's not a should statement that goes associated with that roadway facility type. So now we can jump back into the PowerPoint slides and slide down to the next slide. So one of the pieces of current research in setting of speed limits that's underway right now is NCHRP 1776, which is being done with Texas Transportation Institute and a collection of partners. Kate Fitzpatrick is the lead investigator, and they're looking at evaluating context a lot more and what that would look like, and giving practitioners an understanding of what context looks like for different roadway types. And we should be seeing that document out this year. Some of the states that are involved in that research are already making advances in their policy statements. There's a couple other pieces of research that are out there that will also play a role in setting the speed limits. One is the actual definition of roadway context, and those are being refined from work that was done some time ago to bring those current so that people have better understandings, more clear understanding of a road. What does roadway context mean from a literal standpoint? And then in addition, NCHRP study 3138 or 139 is just getting underway. They're just selecting a contractor and should be coming out in a few years that updates US limits too. That was an area that was also a recommendation from the National Highway Transportation Safety Board about utilizing it. What we found in our survey was very few people were using it, and we felt that it would be very difficult to mandate or write requirements within the MUTCD about a product that folks were just not using before we asked the question why, and FHWA is undertaking that work now. So the next thing that's very clearly coming out are many states are evaluating their policies. And I would say right now, the ones that I'm aware of that are actively involved, and there's probably many others, Oregon, California, Washington, Utah, and Texas are doing a lot of work and a lot of study right now. And I think that will lead to some prototypes and some best practices that everyone can use that can build off the framework that's been developed at the national committee level. Washington is looking at an injury minimization approach, and they're looking at many issues that are taking a look at not using the 85th percentile, relying on it so much in urban town center type circumstances. The other thing is that they already have written in their code some statutory requirements that allow them to use 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. Statutory requirements a lot of times are set, for the interstate system at, 65, 75 or thereabouts, and maybe a couple other roadway types. And I think what we're finding is the research that we've undertaken and has identified that you can set speed limits for various roadway types and set maximum speeds, and having a bigger template or a bigger palette to work from than just 75 or 25 might help in that regard. The other state that's doing a lot of work in this area has already put out some administrative rules, and that's in Oregon. And that slide will be up in a second. There it is. And they've taken an approach of looking at ranges of what maximum speeds can look like that you can set for target speeds to provide that kind of guidance below the 65 on the interstate level, or the 55 statewide, or the 25 for a residential street, or 20 for a business district, which Oregon already has, to encompass setting numbers for different kinds of circumstances like urban core, urban mix, suburban commercial, and suburban fringe. And this is sort of getting at those target speeds and saying that if you're in these ranges for these types of facilities, these would be speeds that you would likely be able to use. And whether you use them statutorily and don't have to do studies, or you choose to go to another speed and conduct a study, it clearly limits the amount of effort and work that would need to be done in terms of collecting data and doing research work, particularly on these arterial streets. So to wrap up the discussion real quickly, one of the areas that we really have before us as a profession is dealing with a coordinated change of culture in the regard to setting of speed limits. It's not just an engineering thing and setting of speeds. We really need to work with our enforcement partners, adjudication, insurance folks, and not only that, the original equipment manufacturers who are out, advertising speed on a daily basis in their commercials. And so there's a lot of partners out there and a lot of opportunity for all of our members to participate in this journey. And I think what we'll be seeing in is substantial change in how speed limits are set across the United States. I've got somebody's echo.
Yeah. Okay,
thank you. That was good. In any case, I think there's really great opportunities that we can work together, particularly with adjudication in the legal system. They've not been the most easily reached group. Enforcement has different professional societies, IACP and the National Sheriff's Association, that are willing partners working together with the Governor's Highway Safety Association that give us really good opportunities to make some meaningful changes here and adapt to the future conditions where we're not setting context just for interstate highways. We're looking at the context as we go through. So with that, I'm most happy to open up the floor and discussion for folks and questions they may have.
This is Alan Sanderson. All my experience has been at a municipal setting, and I'm wondering what the discussion has been as far as achieving compliance in the absence of geometric features, design features that make lower speeds seem natural. Just posting the speed limit, in my experience, it doesn't change the speed. So what's that discussion been like?
I think going forward, there's going to be a lot of different ways to look at this. And, when you think of it, if you have a context that's flat, it's straight, it's open, it's wide, what's the speed going to be? I mean, that's the Bonneville Salt Flat last I checked. That's a drag strip. And so one of the things that we really are going to need to work a lot with is making sure that as we go forward on setting design, not that we can't correct every street that's ever been built to date, but for sure going forward, making sure that we get the context right for the target speeds that we have. The sign itself will not lower the speed. And the research, even the work that's been done in Boston and some in Portland, has shown while there are some modifications on maybe some top end speeds, the 10 plus, the actual speeds necessarily weren't changing that dramatically. And so we need to do a lot more and make sure that we match those contexts. And there are a lot of tools. ITE has got a lot of speed management tools on their website. If you have not gone to the website recently and looked into it on speed management, it's a great resource. There's tons of information there about different tools you can do in various different settings, some of which are not that expensive. Others, like roundabouts, get expensive. But in all regards, there's opportunities. And when we start talking about stimulus about to come out, having shovel-ready projects in the target area of safety and speed ready to go is one of those areas where we could make a lot of impact in a short amount of time.
Hey, this is Kevin Dunn in Florida. I just wanted to make some comments. We've had a context-sensitive approach to target speeds for a while now in project management. And what we've found, in general in Florida, when I did a review of our speed limit postings that are out there, we've always had, environmental factors that can be applied when you're setting a speed limit. And our range can go within 3 to 8 miles per hour from the 85th percentile. So we generally have found that our speed limits are currently posted around the 50th percentile using that range availability. So what I caution our designers when they're looking at projects coming down in the future, whereas they'd like to have it, generally have people go slower, you need to be cognizant that, what's posted is not considered the 85th percentile. That's the first mistake they make.
Yep.
And then, you know, so set a target speed within your project documentation that's actually going to be realistic once it's finished. You know, if you're not making any appreciable environmental changes, then don't try to shoot for the moon and lower the speed limit, you know, 10 miles per hour below what's currently posted. Because what's going to happen, you know, post-construction, traffic ops will have to do an engineering study, and then we're going to have to post it back up to where it was before we started the project. And everyone's been told that we're going to be able to achieve a lower speed limit.
Yeah. No, Kevin, those are great points. And, you know, it brings up a great myth of, you know, everybody thinks that the speeds are posted at 85th. The 1776 work that's done definitely debunks that. The vast majority are set closer to what you just said, is they're closer to the average, the 50th percentile. And generally, those are all, the 50th and 85th are generally within about a 5 mile an hour push one way or the other. And so if you round down, you're getting pretty close to the 50th in many cases. And I think the point earlier that Alan made is that it's not the speed limit that's necessarily, you know, changing driver behavior. The wide open, straight, you know, flat type conditions are the things that affect the driver. And in addition to that, the things that the driver's not so readily aware of, like pedestrian and bicyclists, particularly pedestrians, where they may not see them between parked vehicles, those kinds of conditions can change the context of the road pretty quickly. And so being cognizant of those circumstances, I mean, there's a lot of cases in suburban and rural areas where bicyclists and pedestrians are not that present. There's a lot of places in urban and suburban areas where they are. And setting the speed limit the same way would not seem to be prudent.
Maybe I'd like to chime in here if I have a chance.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is Paul Mackey. I think the fundamental problem was that for many years, the Green Book said that you should use the highest design speed possible on all types of roads except local streets. And so a lot of our streets have been designed with that concept in mind. Now, the latest edition of the Green Book says that the selected design speed, and it's for all types of streets, should be a logical one with respect to a whole pile of conditions. Logical, that could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. It's not really good guidance. So I think there's a lot of room that needs to be worked on to bring that more in line with what people really want for their neighborhoods. And just to throw in a kind of a note, John LaPlante, who unfortunately died from the pandemic just a couple of days ago, worked years to have that changed without success. So I think we have to be aware that if, as you mentioned, we design streets that have characteristics that induce drivers to speed, well, they will speed, and just setting a speed limit in terms of what you would wish to happen, well, you really have to rethink your street design. And just to add to your list of NCHRP projects, there is one that's gone for bid in terms of designing for target speed. So that should be very
underway.
Yeah, so that should be very interesting to see how that will turn things around.
Thanks, Paul. You know, one thing that we did at the national committee level, we asked, it ended up being about 700 or 800 professionals that deal with setting of speed limits and are involved in the transportation system for about 12 different roadway types that we very generally presented. We identified interstate freeways in rural settings, interstate freeways urban, state highways rural, county roads and rural paved, county roads unrural or rural unpaved, suburban 5-lane or bigger type facilities, urban arterials, multi-lane, collector streets, business commercial district, neighborhood streets, local residential streets, and speed zone. And statistically, you know, got 800 people, so you get a, you know, you can do the, you know, statistics stuff, which is pretty cool. The numbers of what people thought without a whole lot of description of what the speed should be for those narrow down pretty darn quickly as to what a maximum speed should be or a target speed. Seems like it's a pretty easy template to, set up for a statutory and just say as a starting point, that's, without having to leave it so wide open as to, what the logical speed is, that those are starting points that you can pivot from. And there'll be cases where it should be slower. There may be cases where it needs to be faster based off of some circumstances. But in most cases, I think, building that template would not be that difficult. And part of the problem may be that we just had this narrow template of statutory speeds.
But just to, if you look at the design approach, was to design 10 miles an hour above the anticipated posted speed.
Yeah. And that
So
may be, for example, that's a good example like the 85th. That might be good on an interstate highway where speeds are high and the consequence of a driver error would be significant. But down at 35 and at 25 or 30 or 40, adding 5 or 10 miles an hour, I don't think, again, it's the context. I don't know that it necessarily applies. And I think AASHTO has picked up on that more recently.
I think, as you say, for urban and town contexts, it's not the appropriate approach.
Yes. Other questions?
I just
Hi,
have,
this is Patrick Wright from Pennsylvania Local Technical Assistance Program. We have two issues in Pennsylvania that we deal with a lot. One of them is rural roads that will have, and these are locally owned rural roads, so they could be 20, 22 feet wide, high crust type roads. And they'll go through farmland, forest, and then all of a sudden a little village
Yes.
of a cluster of 15 to 20 houses, and then boom, it's gone. And we have a lot of difficulty with the people who live in those areas in trying to regulate speed in such a really short section. That's one area. And other area we have difficulty with is the poorly designed neighborhood streets, which are designed like 36 or 40 feet wide, kind of like when some other folks have been already talking about. They'll design a residential street with an 8-foot parking lane, 2 12-foot travel lanes, and another 8-foot parking lane. And then, of course, it becomes a speedway. And then coming back and trying to retrofit design issues with that is very difficult. Just wondered what other people had with experiencing some of those issues in their states.
This is Nathan Boheim. I've seen a lot of those same. I'm at the city of Loveland. We don't have in Colorado. We don't have that small village problem, but the residential streets, yeah, absolutely. I think honestly to say that some of these streets have been designed is a really taking it a lot of step, putting it pretty strongly. Most of these streets, they pulled the template out of the standards book and they marched it down the corridor. That's the limits of the design work that was done. So I think to some extent it's incumbent upon us when we're developing the standard cross sections, that kind of stuff, to consider these things. Though I'll say we just had this discussion with all of our people, and the engineering side doesn't really care. The traffic side wants them narrower-ish. Planning wants them narrow. Fire wants them wide. Utilities wants them wide. And I mean, there's a lot of different people who have input on it, and they're coming at it from a lot of different perspectives. And I think one of the street sections, the city engineer ended up making this determination that if everybody was mad with the result, it must be good.
this is Alan Sanderson. Just a couple of observations. I've, piggybacking on that, I've told people many times they think it's the transportation department that insists on these streets. And I told people it's the fire department and solid waste vehicles that determine the physical layout. And that has been a struggle in trying to do things a little differently in more recent years. The other comment relates to the study showing that speed limits are closer to the 50th percentile than 85th in many areas. And Randy's earlier comment about our court and law enforcement partners. I don't know how widespread this is. I suspect it's fairly widespread, but it was well known in my city. Police didn't enforce until 11 over the speed limit. And we actually, maybe not formally, but we did take that into account when setting speed limits. More than once, someone made the comment, well, if we do that, then nobody will get a ticket until they're going X miles an hour. And we just thought that was a little unreasonable, but we were never successful in making any changes to that 11 over rule.
We have the 11 miles an hour over rule actually in our law here in Pennsylvania. So local police cannot enforce, and also our local police are we're the only state in the nation where local police can't use radar. So they still have to use LiDAR and VASCAR and some other handheld timing devices.
Interesting.
Yeah, hey, this is Marvin calling, also from Pennsylvania, and so like Patrick mentioned, our local police can't use radar yet, and like Alan mentioned too, they can't pull anyone over until they're going over 11. But we even have some municipalities that have stated that our police don't pull people over until going over 15. You know, just because it's such a gray area there for them, and it's so easy for people to fight speeding tickets that, to be sure, they're gonna wait till that 15 mile per hour over that speed limit before enforcing. So.
Okay, well, I'll come back to the comment I made before, where the designer was often designing streets for 10 miles an hour over the anticipated speed limit. So what you have are drivers following the design speed. The design speed has more influence on their behavior than posted speed. So the police are very kind of logical in saying, well, if we were going to ticket people who were going 3 or 4 miles an hour over the speed limit, they'd probably be ticketing everybody. So they figure, well, we have to keep only the upper limit people. So I mean, you can explain it. If the street is designed 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, people will go 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, and police can't enforce the speed limit itself.
Yeah, it is a big part on how the roadway is designed too, but in order to have proper enforcement too, I think you need legislation to back it up as well, right? Before I started working, I got the chance to go to Australia, and I'm sure if you've ever traveled internationally, you can probably see what their enforcement is like over there. And for Australia, you know, police can pull people over going 1 mile over the speed limit. They have that kind of power. And so you see that there is a better compliance with what is posted because of the hefty fines there.
Florida, this is H. Florida tried that a few years ago. They did what they called a high speed enforcement area. It was brought in through the legislature requesting it. And if anyone was 1 mile per hour over the speed limit, they would get a double to triple the normal fine for speeding. That was done for probably under a 2-year period. And it was a huge undertaking to determine where were those locations that would be most effective at. I was in the Jacksonville area, and we kept it under a 5-mile section on one of the major interstates. Some had 60 miles to 90-mile sections. That meant they had to have more enforcement out there to do this, because all the funds actually went to emergency services that were collected.
Hi, all. This is Martina Wilkinson calling from the city of Fort Collins in Colorado. I think, you know, it's been an interesting conversation to hear about how do we design roads that will encourage lower speeds, and then how do you get the enforcement component to go with it? Because I think, you know, Alan said early on, there's such a big difference between simply posting the speed limit to what we think it should be, and then actually achieving a reduction in speed. I think the other thing that I'd love to have some conversation about and get some input on is this relatively robust interest in having all of our local speeds go to 20-mile-an-hour speed limits, and sort of that whole idea of the 20 is plenty, and you often hear that being wrapped into the whole Vision Zero phenomenon in terms of all of our Vision Zero action plans. And at least in the city of Fort Collins, it's been our experience that we have in large part achieved Vision Zero on our local roads. It is a rarity to see any kind of fatal or even serious injury crashes on our local roads. And so we've been really trying hard to focus our Vision Zero on moving the needle for our severe injury and fatal crashes. And quite frankly, that doesn't include our local roads. And so sometimes I struggle a little bit with the whole concept of reducing neighborhood speeds. Not that that's a bad thing to do, but to throw it into the whole Vision Zero bucket when that doesn't move the needle, because the needle is in large part already at zero there, I think is doing a little bit of a disservice to our Vision Zero initiatives, because if we do things that don't move the needle, then that frustrates people. And I'd rather see a more robust discussion about speeds on our arterials, which is where we're seeing the more serious injury and fatal crashes, rather than the 20 is plenty phenomenon that we're seeing. So I'd encourage and welcome comments on that.
In Pennsylvania, I would say on the local road issue, kind of like the one I mentioned before, that's poorly designed, the issue is more quality of life than safety, and just the public having the threat that they feel that somebody driving by is going too fast and is a threat to the kid riding their bike or playing basketball in the street or something like that. So that's the big issue on the local roads. Our big speed issue in Pennsylvania is going to be on the rural road segments, where we have a lot of crashes on, especially curves and things like that. That's probably where we need to focus our speed limit and safety efforts on, are the rural road segments.
Right, I agree. There's just a real distinct difference, in my opinion, between the safety component and the livability component.
Good distinction there. Those are different. You've got different guiding principles in both of those.
Yeah, I agree with that. Again, my experience in my city is exactly the same. Very, very few serious injury or fatal crashes on the local streets. Just a perception of those cars are going faster by my house than they should be, because the streets were designed too wide, too straight.
Just curious, how many people actually have been using US limits 2 at all? For at least in Pennsylvania, we kind of use it as a check. We have our own statutory regulations we have to follow for setting the speed limit, but we always like to kind of use that as a check. Has anybody else been using that program?
I've used it a little bit. Not incredibly impressed with it, quite honestly. It seems to me that 9 times out of 10 it'll give you 85th percentile as its recommendation, and if it doesn't give you 85th percentile, you don't really know why.
You know, Nathan, that's exactly what we, when we went into the national committee work a couple of years ago, I don't think we expected to get, 15% of the people say they've used it. We thought we just didn't know, but to find out there was so little, we sort of were beating ourselves up over why we didn't ask more questions about why. But that's the number one thing: the black box, the factors that people would use for road characteristics not being applied, and seemingly applied the way that a user could trace down why the speed limit was or wasn't lowered according to the factors that were used as inputs. And so I think the users weren't, from what we could tell, that was one of the key factors why they don't use it. And it was the numbers were 85% don't, 15, roughly 85-15 between the non-use and the use of the US limits 2.
We found that the roadside safety factor, where you give it a rating of 1 through 7, actually does have an impact. In Pennsylvania, a lot of our ratings always tend towards the 7, because we have trees about 6 inches off the edge of the road. Then the one other factor we realized that wasn't built into the system, that you could not have a rural road and actually say that it had bicycle and pedestrian use. So you couldn't actually put that in as a factor. The other factor that seemed to move the needle a little bit would be a high crash rate. that would definitely suggest a lower speed on that too. But then other than that, the roadside safety factor moving it, and then the crash data moving it, not much would move it off the 85th percentile speed.
Hey, so Randy, this is Pam. It is about 20 of 4. So I just want to make sure that we honor the time for these sessions.
I certainly appreciate everything ITE has done to put these together, and Randy taking the time to introduce this topic. I think these virtual drop-ins are a great idea. Thank you guys all.
Thank you for participating. Randy, do you have any closing comments? Oh, we may have lost Randy's audio. I think Randy froze. That's never good. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up for Randy. I apologize. I was hoping he'd have some closing remarks, but thank you all again. And this recording will be available later tonight. And I hope you all have a good weekend, and maybe we'll see you next week.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.
Stay safe.